In 1985, a farmer outside Sacramento tore down a collapsing hay barn his father had sealed shut in 1946. Behind the wall sat a crated fighter plane, still wrapped in factory grease, never flown. Nobody in the family knew it was there. But here's the twist. Barns across America have been hiding the leftovers of World War II for 80 years. Souvenirs, war prizes, and machines that were never supposed to come home. Number 12 on this list crossed the ocean packed inside a soldier's footlocker, and number 3 sold at auction for more than the farm it was found on. These weren't stolen. Most were carried home by ordinary GIS who never spoke of the war again. Before we start, hit that subscribe button because some of these finds rewrote history. Let's count down 25 secret World War II weapons found hidden in American barns. Number 25. The Japanese officer's sword wrapped in an old horse blanket. In a barn loft in rural Tennessee, a family cleaning out their late grandfather's tools found a long bundle tied with baling twine and shoved under the eaves. Inside lay a Japanese officer's sword, the lacquer on its scabbard cracked but intact, the silk wrap on the handle darkened by decades of dust. The old man had served in the Pacific and never once mentioned it. These blades came home by the tens of thousands, surrendered by Japanese officers and carried back in duffel bags as the most personal trophy a soldier could keep. Many were family heirlooms, centuries old, handed over in defeat. For years it hung forgotten while tractors rusted below it. When a collector finally examined the tang, he found a smith's signature dating the steel to long before the war, a quiet reminder that some of these barns held history far older than the fight that brought it there. Number 24. The crate of parachute silk in the rafters. Not every treasure was a machine. In an Iowa barn, a beam collapse revealed a wooden crate packed with folded parachutes, the silk still supple, the canvas straps stiff but whole. A returning airman had brought them home, and like so many, he'd meant to do something with them and never did. In the lean years right after the war, parachute silk was gold. Farm wives cut it into wedding dresses, christening gowns, and curtains because store-bought fabric was scarce, and this cloth was finer than anything money could buy. This particular crate had simply been forgotten, sealed in a corner as the family's fortunes improved. When the granddaughter opened it, she found a note tucked between the folds in faded pencil, listing the names of the men in her grandfather's bomber crew, most of whom never came home. Number 23. The Bazooka tubes stacked like fence posts. Along the back wall of a Georgia barn, leaning in a row behind a stack of lumber, sat several long steel tubes an old veteran had brought home as war surplus. Empty, inert, and stripped of anything dangerous, they were the launch tubes of the weapon every GI simply called the Bazooka, named after a comedian's homemade musical instrument it happened to resemble. The soldier had used them for years as makeshift rollers for moving heavy equipment around the property, never mentioning what they had once been. Millions of these were produced, and countless demilitarized shells were sold off cheap after the war. Only when a neighbor recognized the shape did the family understand that their grandfather's fence post rollers had once turned the tide against armor in the hedgerows of France. Number 22. The German helmets in the grain bin. A Wisconsin farmer reaching into an unused grain bin felt something hard beneath the chaff and pulled out a German steel helmet, its distinctive silhouette unmistakable, its paint scarred and pitted. Beneath it lay 4 more. His uncle had returned from Europe with a duffel full of them and, embarrassed by the attention, had buried them in the one place no one ever looked. Helmets were the classic GI souvenir, easy to carry, instantly recognizable, and free for the taking on any battlefield. Boys wore them playing soldier in the yard until they were tossed aside and forgotten. These 5 had survived by being hidden. One still bore a hand-painted unit marking, and years later a historian traced it to a specific division that had fought in Normandy, connecting a dusty Wisconsin grain bin to a beach an ocean away. Number 21. The folding motorcycle meant to drop from the sky. Under a tarp in a Pennsylvania barn sat a strange little motorcycle with folding handlebars, small enough to fit inside a crate. It was a well bike, a tiny collapsible machine designed to be parachuted alongside airborne troops so they could move fast once they hit the ground. Few made it to America, and fewer survived. A paratrooper had shipped this one home in pieces and reassembled it as a curiosity, riding it around the farm until the fuel line cracked and it was pushed into a corner. There it stayed for half a century, its tiny frame gathering cobwebs. When a museum curator saw a photo, he drove across 3 states the same week. It was one of only a handful known to exist intact in the country. Number 20. The Norden bombsight in the tool cabinet. Here's where things get remarkable. Locked inside a battered metal cabinet in an Ohio barn, wrapped in oilcloth, sat one of the most secret devices of the entire war, a Norden bombsight. During the conflict, this instrument was so classified that bombardiers swore an oath to protect it and carried sidearms to destroy it rather than let it fall into enemy hands. It was removed from aircraft under armed guard and stored in vaults. Yet somehow, one ended up on an Ohio farm, brought home by a veteran who'd worked in maintenance and quietly kept a decommissioned unit as a keepsake. The family had no idea what the heavy brass and steel contraption was. They'd assumed it was some kind of surveying tool. It sat beside the wrenches for 40 years, one of the most guarded secrets of the war, gathering dust next to a jar of nails. Number 19. The Japanese rifle behind the workbench. Mounted on 2 nails behind a workbench in a Missouri barn, coated in the same dust as everything else, hung a Japanese service rifle brought back from Okinawa. The bolt had been removed and the barrel plugged long ago, made permanently inert as returning soldiers were often required to do. Its long profile and folding bayonet marked it instantly as a war trophy. The grandfather who carried it home had used it, of all things, as a prop for scaring crows, propping it in the garden window so the silhouette kept birds off the corn. Only after his funeral did anyone notice the small chrysanthemum stamp near the receiver, the mark of the imperial arsenal still faintly visible under the grime. It had traveled from a factory in Japan, across the Pacific, and into a Missouri cornfield, and no one in the family had ever thought to ask where it came from. Number 18. The inflatable decoy tank. In a barn in Kansas, folded into a moldering canvas sack, a family found what looked like a deflated rubber raft the size of a truck. It was an inflatable decoy tank, part of the elaborate deception armies used to fool enemy reconnaissance into believing whole divisions were massed where none existed. Inflated and placed in fields, these rubber dummies looked convincingly real from the air. A veteran who'd served in a camouflage and deception unit had brought one home as the strangest souvenir imaginable. The family had used it once as a child's pool float before realizing what it was. Deception. Saved thousands of lives by drawing fire and attention away from real forces, and this crumpled rubber shell in a Kansas barn was a rare survivor of one of the war's cleverest and least known campaigns. Number 17. The signal flare pistol in the milk can. Dropped inside an old milk can in a Vermont barn, wrapped in a rag, a flare pistol clunked against the metal when a boy tipped the can to clean it. Bulky and snub-nosed, it was the kind used to fire signal flares to mark positions or call for help. It had come home in a sailor's sea bag and been tucked away, forgotten, when he traded the sea for a dairy farm. Flare pistols were common keepsakes, harmless-looking and easy to slip past inspection. Farmers sometimes kept them to signal across distant fields at dusk. This one had simply gone into the milk can and stayed there through 2 generations until a curious grandson tipped it out and wondered why Grandpa had owned something that once flashed warnings across the North Atlantic. Number 16. The German motorcycle sidecar rig. Second pattern break, and this one's a stunner. Under a mountain of hay bales in a Nebraska barn sat a complete German military motorcycle with a sidecar, the kind built for hauling troops and gear across rough country. Its heavy frame and armored-looking sidecar were unmistakable. A GI had shipped it home in crates through the war surplus pipeline, reassembled it, and ridden it until parts wore out and replacements became impossible to find. Then it went under the hay and stayed there. These machines were engineering marvels, and intact examples in America are rare and coveted. When a restorer finally uncovered it, the tires had rotted and the leather had cracked, but the engine numbers matched original wartime records. Collectors flew in from across the country. What a Nebraska farmer had used to buzz around his fields turned out to be worth more than his house. Number 15. The crate of inert grenades used as doorstops. On a shelf in a Texas barn sat a wooden crate stenciled with military markings, and inside, nestled in straw, were rows of grenades. Every one had been drilled, emptied, and rendered completely inert, training dummies and demilitarized war surplus relics, harmless as paperweights. And that's exactly what the family used them for. Painted and polished, they held open barn doors and pinned down paperwork against the Texas wind for decades. The veteran who brought them home had bought them cheap from a surplus lot after the war when such hollow shells sold by the box. The stenciled crate alone, with its original wartime lot numbers, drew interest from collectors who prized the packaging almost as much as the contents. A humble doorstop, it turned out, had a paper trail leading straight back to a wartime depot. Number 14. The Enigma-style Cipher machine in the attic loft. Tucked in the loft of a Connecticut barn, inside a scuffed wooden case, a family found a typewriter that was not a typewriter. Rows of lettered keys sat above a second bank of glowing lamp letters and a set of rotating wheels, a cipher machine of the kind used to scramble secret messages. Whether a genuine captured example or a related encoding device, it had come home with an officer who had worked in intelligence and never spoke a word about his service. Breaking enemy codes was one of the most decisive achievements of the war, kept secret for decades afterward. The family had assumed the strange keyboard was a broken adding machine and nearly hauled it to the dump. Instead, a phone call to a museum turned that dusty wooden case into one of the most significant finds on this entire list. Number 13. the disassembled machine gun in a feed sack. Inside a burlap feed sack hanging from a nail in an Alabama barn, a farmer found the pieces of a heavy machine gun, its parts wrapped in oiled paper and separated so that no single component was functional. A veteran had brought the demilitarized relic home this way, deactivated and disassembled as regulations demanded, purely as a keepsake of the weapon he'd served beside. Broken down into harmless parts, it had waited in the sack for 50 years. Weapons like these anchored defensive lines and were among the most recognizable arms of the war. Collectors of deactivated military relics prized complete examples, and the fact that every piece was accounted for in that single feed sack made it a rare survivor. The farmer had felt the sack full of heavy metal parts 100 times without ever guessing what it held. Number 12. The compass and instruments smuggled home in a footlocker. Number 12 crossed the ocean packed inside a soldier's footlocker, hidden beneath folded uniforms. In a Michigan barn, that same footlocker turned up, still latched, and inside were the cockpit instruments of a warplane: an altimeter, a compass, an airspeed gauge, their glass faces intact, and their needles frozen at the moment power was cut. A ground crew mechanic had salvaged them from a wrecked aircraft slated for scrap and shipped them home as mementos of the machines he'd kept flying. For decades, the footlocker sat unopened, a time capsule of a young man's war. When his family finally lifted the lid, the instruments still smelled faintly of aviation fuel and old leather. Each dial was a fragment of a specific aircraft, and aviation historians were able to trace the serial numbers back to a bomber that had flown missions over Europe. Number 11. The captured pistol in the flour bin. Buried in an old flour bin in an Indiana barn, sealed in a mason jar to keep out the damp, sat a captured enemy sidearm, its finish worn to bare metal at the edges. Handguns were the ultimate personal trophy, small enough to slip into a pocket and carry home without a word. This one had belonged to an officer who surrendered it, and the GI who took it kept it hidden his entire life, telling no one. The mason jar had protected it perfectly. When the family found it decades later, still nested in its glass, they debated for years whether to keep it or turn it over. What made it remarkable wasn't the pistol itself, but the small engraved presentation plate on the grip, which named its original owner and allowed historians to reconstruct exactly where and when it had changed hands. Number 10. The Barrage balloon winch and cable. Bolted to the floor of a coastal Maine barn sat a massive steel winch wound with hundreds of feet of aircraft cable. It had once tethered a Barrage balloon, one of the great silver blimps that floated over harbors and beaches to force enemy planes higher and to snare low-flying attackers in their cables. After the war, the surplus winches were sold off, and a fisherman had bought this one to haul boats and lift engines. It worked so well, he never questioned its origins. The balloons themselves are long gone, but the heavy machinery that flew them occasionally surfaces on old farms, repurposed and forgotten. This winch had spent decades doing honest work on the Maine coast, its wartime job as a guardian of the sky, remembered by no one but the rust. Number 9. The Japanese battle flag in the Bible chest. Folded inside a cedar chest in an Oregon barn, pressed between old quilts, a family found a Japanese battle flag covered edge to edge in handwritten characters. These flags were carried by soldiers as personal talismans, signed by friends and family with messages of good luck before they went to war. Captured by the tens of thousands, they became one of the most common Pacific souvenirs, small enough to fold into a pocket. This one had come home with a Marine and been tucked away, half out of respect and half out of the weight of memory. In recent years, groups have worked to return these signed flags to the descendants of the men who carried them, reuniting families with the last trace of a lost relative. This Oregon flag, decades after being folded into a cedar chest, found its way home across the Pacific. Number 8. The Halftrack hidden under a hay wagon. Third pattern break, and this one's enormous. In a cavernous barn in Montana, parked beneath a false floor built over it, sat an armored half-track, part truck, part tracked vehicle, the workhorse that carried infantry into battle. A rancher had bought it as war surplus for next to nothing, used it to plow snow and haul cattle feed through brutal winters, and then, when it finally broke down, built a hay platform right over the top of it and forgot it was there. His grandchildren discovered it only when the platform sagged and they crawled underneath to investigate. Surplus vehicles like these were sold off by the thousands after the war and put to work on American farms, but few survived intact. This one, sheltered from the weather for decades, emerged nearly complete, its olive drab paint still clinging to the armored sides. Number 7. The glider fuselage in the tobacco barn. Suspended from the rafters of a Kentucky tobacco barn, its canvas skin hanging in tatters, was the frame of a combat glider, the silent, engineless aircraft towed behind planes and released to land troops and equipment behind enemy lines. Built cheaply of wood and fabric and considered expendable, most were destroyed on landing or scrapped. A veteran who had flown into battle aboard one had somehow acquired a surplus fuselage and hung it in his barn as a memorial to the men who rode those fragile crates into combat, many of whom did not survive the landing. For 50 years it hung there, curing in the same warm air as the tobacco leaves. Restoration experts called it one of the most complete surviving examples in the country, a ghost of one of the war's most dangerous jobs, preserved by a single man's refusal to forget. Number 6. The amphibious Jeep in the pond shed. Behind a pond in a Louisiana barn, half sunk in mud, sat a Jeep unlike any other, an amphibious version built to drive straight from land into water and float. These were tricky, temperamental machines, produced in limited numbers and quickly retired. A veteran had bought one as surplus, delighted by its ability to cross the bayou, and used it to check crawfish traps until it finally quit. Then it went into the pond shed and stayed. Amphibious Jeeps are among the rarest of surplus vehicles, and intact survivors are prized by collectors worldwide. This one, though muddy and seized, retained its watertight hull and its original data plate. What a Louisiana farmer had used to putter across a pond turned out to be a piece of engineering history worth a small fortune. Number 5. The crated anti-tank gun still on its wheels. Wheeled into the back of a Colorado barn and draped in tarps, a full anti-tank gun sat on its original carriage, its long barrel still pointing at the barn door as if guarding it. Rendered permanently inert, its firing mechanism removed, it had been sold as a demilitarized display piece after the war and bought by a veteran who wanted a monument to his old unit. He had meant to mount it in his yard and never got around to it. So it waited in the barn, wheels chalked, for decades. Field guns like these stopped armored advances and were the backbone of defensive lines. Complete carriages are extraordinarily rare, since most were scrapped for their metal. This one, sheltered and intact down to its towing hardware, drew bids from military museums the moment word got out. Number 4. The nose turret of a heavy bomber. In a sprawling barn in South Dakota, resting on wooden blocks in a shadowed corner, sat the plexiglass and metal nose section of a 4-engine heavy bomber, its framework of gun mounts empty and its glass yellowed with age. A veteran gunner had salvaged it from a plane being scrapped and brought it home, unable to part with the tiny space where he'd spent the longest hours of his life. He'd sit in it sometimes, family said, alone in the barn, and never explained why. Heavy bombers took staggering losses, and the men who flew in these exposed glass noses had some of the most dangerous jobs of the air war. When aviation restorers examined the section, they matched it to a specific aircraft and a specific crew. And for the gunner's family, that cracked glass bubble became the most precious thing on the property. Number 3. The intact fighter plane in the wall. Number 3 sold at auction for more than the farm it was found on. In that Sacramento barn, from the very start of this list, behind a false wall the father had built and sealed in 1946, sat a complete single-engine fighter plane, disassembled into major sections and packed in factory grease, never flown in combat. It had come through the surplus system at the end of the war, when brand new aircraft were sold for pennies on the dollar or simply scrapped by the thousands. The father, a former pilot, couldn't bear to see them destroyed and bought one, meaning to restore it someday. That day never came, and he walled it up and told no one. When his son broke through the plaster and found the fuselage gleaming under its preservative coating, restorers wept. A wartime fighter, factory fresh and untouched for 40 years, was worth more than the land, the house, and the barn combined. Number 2. The tank buried in the earthen embankment. On a farm in rural Virginia, a bulldozer clearing an old embankment struck steel, and when the operator dug down, he uncovered the hull of a battle tank buried deliberately decades earlier. A veteran had brought the demilitarized surplus vehicle home, used it to clear stumps and pull equipment out of the mud, and when it finally died, he had simply pushed it into a low spot and covered it over rather than pay to haul it off. The earth had preserved the lower hull remarkably well. Surplus tanks were sold cheap after the war and put to hard agricultural use, but almost none survive because scrap dealers eventually claimed nearly all of them. This buried Virginia hull, protected by the very dirt that hid it, emerged as one of the rarest finds a farm has ever yielded. A war machine returned from the ground it had been laid to rest in. And finally, number 1. The prototype no records could explain. In a locked barn in New Mexico, sealed since the late 1940s and left untouched in a will, investigators found a vehicle that matched no standard production model, an experimental machine, part of the endless wartime effort to design something faster, tougher, or stranger than the enemy could counter. Its owner had worked at a proving ground where dozens of one-off prototypes were built, tested, and usually destroyed. Somehow he had saved this one from the scrapper's torch and hidden it on his own land, where it sat under canvas for the rest of his life. When historians examined it, they found features that never appeared in any surviving blueprint: an orphan of a program lost to the shredder and the passage of time. It was the only one of its kind left in the world, and it had spent 70 years hidden in a New Mexico barn, waiting for someone to open the door. Across all 25 finds, One truth runs through every barn on this list. These weren't weapons hidden by conspiracy. They were carried home by ordinary men who had seen extraordinary things and couldn't quite let them go. Some became doorstops and crow scarers. Some were walled up and never spoken of again. But every one of them was a fragment of the largest conflict in human history, preserved by accident and silence in the quiet dark of an American barn. Which find surprised you most? Tell me in the comments and check your own barn before you tear it down. You never know what your grandfather left behind.